Professor Ludlam, I want to turn to the topic of testing for hepatitis C and ask you to look at 2 paragraphs of your witness statement. Shumik, it's WITN 3428001 and it's page 102. If we could look at paragraphs 283 and 284, you say this: following the identification of the Hep C virus in 1989, we considered our virologic studies with Professor Simmons, who established the initial laboratory techniques for assessing the virus and its specific antibody. As a result of our initial investigations, it became clear that there were shortcomings in the first-generation antibody and that second-generation assay results are more reliable. Patients were given results of investigations when we were confident that they were accurate and informative. They were informed that what had previously been referred to as hepatitis or non-A, non-B hepatitis was now identified as Hep C. It was not a new diagnosis, but rather a renaming of the condition. Can I ask you, first of all, when did you undertake the testing with the first generation test?
I think, can we take down the text, please, so I can see you? I think it was probably...
Can I just ask you to pause there for a moment, Professor? Because we've got it back. We just lost you on our big screen here, and I was concerned there might have been problems elsewhere in the countries, but I doubt there are. And I gather, as it happens, that the intermittent sound problems have been resolved. Please let us know if they haven't, because then some further technical work will have to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the first generation tests.
Either 1989 or early 1990 is my recollection.
And when
I'm sorry. When it became possible.
And when your statement says patients were given results of investigations when we were confident they were accurate and informative, does that mean that patients were not given the results of the first generation tests, but were only given their results after you carried out the second generation tests?
I think that's correct, yes.
And do you know when the second generation tests were undertaken, approximately?
I think from about 1991 onwards. Exactly when in 1991, I'm not quite sure. But certainly by 1992, I think we would have had what we call second generation test results available.
In relation to the first generation tests, were those tests undertaken on stored samples?
I think they probably were. In fact, we had my recollection, although I haven't actually seen any documentary evidence when I went through my archive before the lockdown. I have a recollection that we wrote to patients when the first generation tests became available, to ask them about their history of jaundice and hepatitis, so that we had an accurate picture. We explained this, that we had got a new test and we were looking into its utility, and it would help if we had these. So patients were alerted to the fact that there was a potentially new test coming along.
Were patients told as a matter of fact or offered as a matter of fact testing and invited to consent to it at the first generation test stage?
No, we certainly weren't. I don't think we were inviting people up to give a blood sample for a first generation test. I may be wrong. It is likely we would have said new tests become available. We have samples available in the regular storage, but we want, and we would like to test it, or we would use these for assessing the new test. But we would like to be as clear as possible as to what you, the patient, knows of your hepatitis background. It was a way of trying to quickly gather up such information, because some of the patients obviously have been treated elsewhere, and their histories, transfusion histories, for example, where we had obviously for patients in Edinburgh, but they may have been treated. So that's where I was in 1989, early 1990.
So you think there was a letter sent to patients, but we don't have a copy of it. You haven't provided a copy.
I don't. I think it was a letter and questionnaire, as along the lines I've described.
Would it have been placed in the patient's medical records?
I don't think so, no.
Where would this material, these documents go?
It was. I don't know where they would have gone. This was 30 years ago. It was not. It was, if you like, a small research project, and the paperwork for that is now no longer in existence. I don't recall. All the responses would have been put together in a file, presumably for this investigation.
Were all your patients written to, as far as you can recall, and tested using the first generation test on stored samples, or only some of them?
Oh, I think almost certainly only some of them.
Do you know how you decided which patients you might perform the first generation test on and which you would not?
I would suspect it would be the people with severe haemophilia.
In terms of the second generation tests, the more reliable ones, as you've described them in your statement, were those tests also undertaken using stored samples?
I think they were, yes.
Evidence that the inquiries received might suggest that was done without patients' knowledge and consent, and that they found out only afterwards when they were told the result. Is that your understanding, or do you think it was undertaken in a different way?
No, I think that's correct.
What were the arrangements that were made then, once you had what you regarded as a reliable second generation result? What were the arrangements for telling patients their diagnosis?
We would have explained the result of the second generation test almost certainly at their next clinic visit. We wouldn't have called patients up specifically to hear the result. They'd come to the clinic. We would say, as you may know, a new test has become available for non-A, non-B hepatitis. It's now a specific test. And so instead of calling it non-A, non-B hepatitis, we can call it hepatitis C. So it is a condition that has changed its name, but not the condition is still the same, but it's now got a rather more specific name to it.
Would you, at that stage, whether it's 92 or 93 or whenever they're presenting for next at the hospital, would you have told them anything other than that? Is there any more information you'd have given them about the condition, or just it's what you always had and it's got a new name?
No, we had very close collaboration with Professor Peter Hayes, who was a hepatologist, and a very helpful hepatologist. And all the patients were seen by him either with myself or with Dr. Rosie Dennis, who worked in the department with me, at a clinic. Professor Hayes would come regularly, perhaps every month or so. We'd have a clinic together, and if patients turned up between times on my clinic that he wasn't there, he was very helpful. If he was available and I phoned him, he would come down and see a patient. So he was very readily available, and it was he who discussed, if you like, the more hepatological aspects of hepatitis C and what it meant for the patients.
Were post-mortems routinely done on bleeding disorder patients in Scotland, to your knowledge, in the period from 1980 onwards?
I'm sorry, I have difficulty responding to that because the number of patients, fortunately, who died initially were not very many, but then, of course, many more died from HIV. I'm sorry, I can't remember about autopsies for patients. In general, particularly in the 1980s, there was a general view, particularly working in a teaching hospital, that it was additional information could often be obtained from an autopsy, and that, depending very much on the circumstances, one would consider whether an autopsy might be helpful, and if it seemed appropriate, to ask the relatives. But in relation to how many were undertaken, and particularly when patients sadly were dying of HIV, I think there were probably a reluctance to undertake autopsies, but I'm sorry, I can't offer you more than those thoughts.
Do you know what tissue or other samples were retained from deceased bleeding disorder patients?
From the autopsies?
Yes.
I don't, but I think it would be usual for what are called the paraffin blocks. Perhaps I could explain. At autopsy, small pieces of different organs would be taken for histology to look at down the microscope, and they would be processed in little, which involved making little paraffin blocks of the tissue, which were then very thinly sliced, stained, and looked at under the microscope by the pathologist. The blocks, paraffin blocks of tissue, I think, as far as I understand it, are kept long term for for a whole variety of reasons, but I think those may have been retained.
And do you know where those would be stored, and indeed who might be the best authority or person to make inquiries about this further with?
They would be stored by the histopathology department. They would have systems for keeping these.
Would the decision as to what to retain be the decision of the histopathologist, the pathologist, or the clinician who'd been involved during the patient's lifetime, such as yourself?
Probably the pathologist.
They
would have they would have it would be routine practice, I think, to retain these little paraffin blocks of particular organs. You'd need to ask a pathologist exactly what the criteria are. And, if they were, I think they would be kept whether they were abnormal or normal. If I can put it that way, they're not discarded if they're normal. But it's not an area, and it's an area that potentially the regulations have changed, obviously, with the Human Tissue Act, both the one for England and the separate one for Scotland.
Do you know of any research or investigations undertaken on histological or other tissue or blood samples from deceased bleeding disorder patients who were treated at the Edinburgh Centre?
Well, I was sent and reminded yesterday afternoon after our session about the retrospective studies that were undertaken in relation to variant CJD.
Apart from that one, sorry to interrupt, Professor Ludlam, I'll come on to that in just a moment.
Okay.
Apart from that one, are you aware of any others?
I can't recall any at the moment.
Again, do you think it's possible that there may have been others, and that you might be able to make further inquiries to find out the answer to that? Or is it a question better directed at others?
Let me just be clear. Is your question about whether there were any other retrospective studies carried out on stored tissue samples from autopsies?
Yes.
Patients who died with haemophilia or another bleeding disorder?
Yes.
I don't know of any others. I'm not. I think it would probably be appropriate to ask the pathologists because I think it likely they will have an index of their reports and those that have had haemophilia and what investigations have been done. I obviously can't speak about patients before 1980. That's the best I can do, but I don't think, but I think asking histopathologists would be the...
Did you undertake any research or investigations using blood samples from deceased patients who'd been treated at the Edinburgh Centre?
I take it from that you mean samples taken while the patient was alive,
Yes.
stored, and then unfortunately the patient died, and we did investigations after they had died on the sample taken before, not samples taken at autopsy.
That you've correctly understood the question, Professor.
Right. I think it likely we will have assessed samples later. I'm trying to view 30 years of work in a teaching hospital, and I can't say I didn't, but I'm trying to think when we might have done, and obviously I'm thinking in terms of these various viral infections that we've been discussing. Because most of the investigations we did were on people who were alive and for their benefit. I can't say it never happened, but I'm struggling to see when it might have happened. I'm sorry to be. I'm not trying to be evasive. I'm trying to be accurate, and I'm finding it difficult.
Do you know if there were ever any fatal accident inquiries contemplated or undertaken in relation to any of the deaths of patients treated at the Edinburgh Centre?
No, I don't think there were, no.
And then if we look at the report that I think you've got a copy of, we'll put it on the screen as well, HCDO 40-133_024. So it's retrospective neuropathological review of prion disease in UK haemophilic patients. We can see there are a number of authors. Professor Lee is first, Dr. Giangrandi, and then your name. We can also see the name of Professor Ironside. And then we see a list of bodies involved, of which we can see the CJD Surveillance Unit in Edinburgh and then the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh. If we go to page 3, please. In the first paragraph, we can see, picking it up in the second line, we've examined the brains of 33 HIV-positive haemophilic patients who died from HIV/AIDS or liver disease. The patients were treated with clotting factor manufactured from British and commercial, predominantly from the US, plasma pools averaging 20,000 donors. However, it's been the practice at all 3 haemophilia centres, Royal Free, Oxford and Edinburgh, to use British donor-sourced plasma clotting factor concentrate whenever possible. And then it goes on to discuss that in further detail. Professor, my questions are just going to be about the process, not about the findings themselves. How did patients of Edinburgh, deceased patients of Edinburgh, come to be involved, or how did you come to be involved in this study?
This arose because of the appearance of variant CJD in 1996, and as I think the inquiry is aware, I arranged a meeting in 1997 at which we considered possibility that the prion, VCJD prion, if I can put it that way, might be transmitted by blood products. And but at that stage, there had been no episodes of apparent VCJD transmission by blood. As you will be aware, subsequently there were, I think, 3 episodes in which patients developed variant CJD from blood transfusions. But at this stage, there hadn't been any. but the possibility being raised was taken sufficient. Our recommendations were taken sufficiently seriously that major changes occurred in the way blood products were provided within the UK. The situation was that we weren't aware of any patients with haemophilia having developed variant CJD, but we wondered whether there was any possibility that patients could have been so, if I can put it this way, infected. And one way of potentially looking for evidence is what this study was about, because at that stage, and even now, there is no blood test that will detect the abnormal prion reliably. So that was the background at a time when there was much uncertainty about whether VCJD could be transmitted by clotting factor concentrates.
And what was your involvement in the study?
I think this was led by Christine Lee, and I forget exactly what my involvement was. I knew the colleagues, James Ironside and Jan Bell, well. I'm sure I had some discussions with them, but they would be the individuals who obviously carried out the study in their unit and in their university department.
It would seem from the passage we just looked at that the study would have involved examination of samples of brain tissue from some Edinburgh patients. Do you know where those samples had been held?
They would have been held by the pathology departments in Edinburgh.
Do you know how many of the 33 patients referred to in the study were Edinburgh patients?
No, I don't.
Do you know whether any attempt was made to inform or seek the views of or seek the agreement of the families of the deceased patients, either for the retention of the tissue samples or for the involvement in the study?
I imagine the retention of the what I take to be what we were talking about earlier, the paraffin blocks, that would be part of the routine way in which samples were stored. Not just obviously these patients, but all patients who underwent autopsy. You also ask whether relatives were asked for their consent. I think almost certainly they weren't.
Want to come on more broadly to some...
Could I, before, if you wish to leave that topic, I think it highly likely that this study will have been reviewed by the Lothian Ethics Committee, and it may well have been undertaken anonymous. The patients may have been anonymized. These sort of details are important, and I think James Ironside and Jan Bell were eminent, very good histopathologists, academic histopathologists, and I think they would only have moved forward perhaps on that basis.
So just before we move on to the next topic, I know a question's been raised by a core participant as to the circumstances in which Professor Ludlam was sent overnight the document. I can confirm it was sent to him by the inquiry.
Yes.
For the very reason of wanting to ask a question about it. Professor, I'm going to move on more generally to questions of research. And before we look at a couple of examples of specific studies or areas of research at the centre, I just have some general questions I wanted to ask you. Do you accept that it's always been a fundamental principle of medical research that it's based on the participants, the subjects, having given their informed consent to participation?
I think that's reasonable, yes.
In the studies with which you were involved, the research studies with which you were involved, did you ensure that patients were told that they could withdraw from it at any stage?
Most of the investigations that we were doing, although they were labelled as research, were in fact for the ongoing evaluation of the patient. We would often refer to new investigations as research, and they were, as I say, mostly for the ongoing benefit of the patients. And patients were actually quite interested to learn a bit more about the research, and we're happy to tell them. So we were working in a teaching hospital environment, and research was something they were familiar with. They were often kind enough to see students and for me to teach students round the bed, or they're kind enough to come along to seminar rooms and tell other doctors about haemophilia and what it is like as a condition. So there was a very open relationship with the patients. I would say that they were giving their agreement to the sort of work that we were doing, because it only involved usually an extra teaspoonful of blood when they were having blood taken anyway, and they were asked if they'd be happy for some to be put aside for Dr. Ludlam's research projects. In relation to your specific question, were they specifically told they could refuse? I don't actually recall anyone expressing a wish not to participate. They might ask more questions, and I think there's research and research, if I can put it that way, or investigation. There is investigations, ongoing investigations that could be done on blood samples, and the patients come up to hospital for their routine appointments or for whatever reason they may be seen. There's then quite different research in which they may be asked to participate in new therapy or some procedure, and that would be very carefully explained to them. There might well be, particularly for new therapy, an information sheet and a formal consent form, and a very formal arrangement, and it would be clear that they didn't have to agree to that.
But were they expressly told that if they did agree, they could change their mind and withdraw?
I don't think we were explicit with that, but no one I recall showed reservations about the sort of what they were being asked to do, and I was happy to talk to them about it. And a lot of it was actually, although it's called research, now in my statement I've gone into different sorts of research. I don't know whether you want to go there just now, but what we describe as research are often new investigations that were for the patient's benefit, or potentially.
In relation to the process you describe about taking some extra blood and saying, can I take some extra blood for Dr. Ludlam's research? Two questions, if I may. First of all, who amongst the centre's staff would ordinarily be the person having that conversation?
That would be whoever was taking the blood sample.
How often would that be you?
Particularly in the early 1980s, it would be me most of the review clinics. It would be me most of the time, because we didn't have a haemophilia sister, we didn't have phlebotomists, so it would be me who would be, and the other people would be the registrars working with me.
Did you spell out to the patient what the actual research was going to be?
I would probably have said what we were doing at that particular moment, what our interest was, what the new area of interest was, and consent is an ongoing process. In a sense, it's keeping people informed about what is happening, and as time went by and the situations changed, for example, when HIV came along, then the discussion would have been what we're doing in relation to HIV to monitor their situation. So it was a continuous process, and part of the what I think was a close relationship between this relatively small group of patients and a small group of staff who were working together, trying to help the patients.
It sounds, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, it sounds as though the kind of conversation you're describing, the kind of information being given to patients when you're taking the extra round of blood, is pretty general in nature. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. We did consider at one stage actually having an information sheet explaining about what the blood was being tested for, and for research investigations. I came across the form when I was going through my archives earlier this year, and I can't actually remember whether we introduced it or not. I remember a discussion about the form, because, as I say, the form is in the archive. I remember we had a discussion, and I can't remember whether the result of the discussion was, well, let's use it, or whether, and this was the discussion within the team, or whether the outcome was, well, the patients are pretty well informed anyway, so we don't need this. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful than that. What I can say is that when the patients came up, particularly for treatment with acute bleeds and general practitioner issues. They were all entered into the diary, the clinic diary, and what the outcome was of their visit, how they were treated, and a record was kept of what blood samples had been taken and for what purposes. So there was a pretty careful record of what went on in the Haemophilia Centre in relation to samples. And I tell you about this consent form, and I'm sorry, I can't remember whether we actually instituted it and they signed it and they were put away in a folder, or whether we decided actually the patients were well informed that we were trying to promote and develop good haemophilia care through our endeavours.
Your witness statement says that the principal responsibilities of the centre included undertaking research and participating in trials. Was that actually set out as a requirement, as a job description, as it were, for you or for the centre?
Yes, that's part of HSC 76C health circular that also applied in Scotland, that sets out the responsibilities of haemophilia centres.
Do you think it possible that your extensive research commitments limited your ability to provide clinical care to your patients?
Absolutely not. I think our research activities promoted better clinical care.
Can we look at BART 40552_001? We can see here it's a letter. It's not a letter that you'd have seen. It's July 96. It's Professor Lee to Professor Preston. If we just go further down. Little paragraph 2. In individuals who've been infected with HCV, PCR positivity, etc., etc. And then it says this: such detailed analysis would only be possible where there's a longitudinal sera store, possibly only Edinburgh and the Royal Free. Wanted to ask you a little more about this sera store, described here as a longitudinal sera store. How far back did the Edinburgh sera store go?
Well, in the virology department, it went back into the 1970s. In hematology, for reasons that I explained a day or two ago, we started a parallel store about 1982 is my recollection. When I referred to the deep freeze failure in the virology department, that was one of, they had a whole bank of deep freezes, and I don't know over what time period the hematology samples, haemophilia samples that were destroyed. There may well have been ones that went back to the 1970s that were still intact, that weren't in the freezer that broke down.
Was there something different or unique about the position at the Edinburgh Centre and the Royal Free than other hospitals, other haemophilia centres, in terms of the sera store?
So I'm just trying to think of what happened at other haemophilia centres, and of course, I don't have detailed insight. It was one of the advantages of the audit process that we started in Scotland and then extended to England in the early 1990s, that actually one had the opportunity to go around and see how other haemophilia centres operate. It was very educational, actually. But in relation to this particular question, I can think possibly Birmingham must have had a similar store, because they were able to detect seroconversions to commercial concentrate in 1986. So it was not unique, I have to say. I think it was a good practice, if not almost, well, good practice. I won't say it's essential, but it was good practice to do so.
What, you can take the document now down, Shimmy. What were patients told about the store, the storage of their samples, and the uses to which they might be put?
They were told that they were for research or new tests.
Did you take the view that was sufficient in terms of consent for the stored samples to be used for whatever research purposes or testing you chose?
It certainly wouldn't be nowadays. And I like to think that our patients were pretty much in touch with what our research interests were, because we shared this information with the patients. It's part of coming up and see something to talk about when they were at the clinic and when they were getting their treatment. But I didn't at that stage explain in detail to individual patients exactly what tests would be done on these samples.
And did you ever, when using the samples subsequently, whether it's for testing for hepatitis C or for any other form of research or study, did you ever go back to the patient and say, we now want to use the sample you gave for us and which has been sitting in our deep freeze for 8 years for the following purposes?
My reason for pausing is because I was thinking of the various things we had done and what was research and what was for the benefit of the patients. And I like to say two things, I think. One is perhaps to reiterate that the patients were in touch with what our general research endeavours were, in other words, infections and immunity. And I recall an instance in the haemophilia treatment room where the nurse had taken some blood from a patient that I'd come to see, and the little bottles were lined up on the counter, and the patient, oh gosh, they've got 4 or 5 tubes there. Where are they all going? What are they all for? And the nurse went down them each in turn, explaining what they were going to be used for, and I think one of them in this instance was in relation to HIV virus, and was explaining about that. There were other investigations that the patients may not have been aware of, but that we thought important to do for the patient's benefit. And I take as an example parvovirus. we've not talked about parvovirus yet, and happy to do so, but one of the criteria for using recombinant concentrates, one of the priorities were people who were parvo negative. And therefore we needed to screen the patients to see who had been infected with parvo previously, because most of us are infected, as you're probably aware, as small children.
Can you actually recall any instance in which attempts were made to inform and seek consent from a patient when a sample that had been stored for a period of time, excuse me, was being used?
Used for?
For whatever purposes you might want to use it for.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I could easily have said to a patient, let's say someone who turns out with hepatitis C, we could try and ascertain when you became infected, and we could do that by looking back at samples in the deep freeze. I might easily have said that to the patient, and we'd have looked back and been able to help the patient. And the same has obviously happened, not with the same consent, if you like, with HIV or with HTLV3, although some of the people who came to see me, we may have had positive results and no negative results, and part of the discussion would have been, should we look back or should I see if another haemophilia centre where you have been treated previously has samples, because patients, move house and so on. So there were instances when patients were told and asked.
I'll ask you about the AIDS study, which I understand you began on in 1983. And you gave quite extensive evidence to the Penrose inquiry in relation to this, and I don't want to simply repeat that exercise. What you told the Penrose inquiry in summary was that you began work with Dr. Michael Steele, who was a cell biologist and immunologist at the Western General Hospital in early 1983, on a study of CD4 and CD8 lymphocytes in people with haemophilia. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that involved taking blood from haemophilia patients at the haemophilia centre.
That involved taking an extra, either half a teaspoonful or a teaspoonful of blood when they were having blood taken anyway.
Again, without wanting to go through the lengthy pages of the Penrose transcripts in relation to this, my understanding of what you told them is that there would be some form of analysis performed within the Royal Infirmary, and then the samples would be couriered to Dr. Steele at the Western General Hospital for his work. Is that it's a brief summary, but is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, yes.
The forms or documents, I don't have an example here, but I'm sure you know the ones that I'm talking about. You looked at them at the Penrose inquiry again. Describe this as an AIDS study. Those are the words written on various forms. Why do you say it was so described?
Well, it was a study because of the, when I say it's a study, the investigations were being carried out as a result of the AIDS that had appeared in and been reported in people with haemophilia in the United States. It was an immunological study, but it was labelled AIDS study in rather large letters, so that when the samples reached the laboratory in the Royal Infirmary, it was clear that the extra small sample needed to be couriered rapidly to the Western.
And results or findings from the analyses that were undertaken were, again, as I understand from your evidence of the Penrose inquiry, not included in the patient's notes.
They're included in the computer records, the patient's computer records. Yes.
Okay.
Not in their paper records, because there were no hospital forms. You could only put into the patient's notes approved forms approved by the Medical Records Committee, and we had a computer. We were about the lead department in the hospital for computerization, and we set up a small database. It was quite innovative at the time, with patients' results on, so that when we're in the Haemophilia Centre or the ward or my office or the registrar's office, we could get hold of results easily. It was very carefully password protected, so it was very confidential, but it was seen as very innovative in the hospital, so much so that they asked me to form and chair a computer committee. So it was one more thing I had to do as a result of this rather successful enterprise. But the result of these tests done by Dr. Steele's department were entered on this system.
And patients were not advised of the results of what the analysis showed, were they?
I think that's correct.
And they didn't lead to any advice or being given, for example, to patients about the management of their conditions in light of the results?
Well, let me say, I undertook, started these investigations because of the abnormalities that had been described in the New England Journal of Medicine in January 1983. One of the possible conclusions from those studies was that there was the abnormalities reflected the presence of an AIDS virus or putative AIDS virus widely disseminated in the haemophilia population. And I thought that we should look at similar investigations in our department, because I felt, as you know, that our patients hadn't been exposed to the virus, and I fully expected the results to be normal. And it was, I nearly didn't do the study or set up the investigations. When they started coming back abnormal, I was very surprised and perplexed, and quite a bit of puzzlement. There were other explanations apart from an AIDS virus, but I was surprised that we showed up these abnormalities.
Your and Dr. Steele's analysis of results and conclusions that you drew from them were published, I think, in the Lancet in 1983 and further in the Lancet in 1984. I wasn't proposing to go to the detail of your findings, but that's right, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Do you still maintain, as you told the Penrose inquiry, that this was not research but was part of the general monitoring of patients?
Yes, I do. It was monitoring the patients because abnormalities have been shown in other patients with haemophilia that might be of significance, and I felt that it was my obligation to conduct similar investigations on our patients.
It's right, I think, that in relation to the work you've been describing, you didn't seek or obtain ethical approval.
Not for this particular, these particular investigations, because I consider them to be part of what we should be doing to monitor the health of our patients.
You did seek ethical approval, I think you've said, for work undertaken in 1984 as part of the same research, which involved skin tests?
Oh, certainly. The skin testing was part of the ongoing assessment of immunity, but it was less clear what the results might be or how they might be interpreted, but it involved a procedure, applying a small device to the forearm of patients, and we didn't invite everybody to do this because they had to come back 2 days later and had the skin test results read. So we only invited people who would find it easy and convenient to come back 2 days later. But I sought ethical approval for this because it was, if you like, an invasive, although small, procedure.
Why was the skin testing research, but the blood testing analysis and investigation not research, when the purpose of the two was identical?
I think it was because the results of the, and one only does this in prospect, and to know what the results are going to be. The skin testing was a rather more speculative investigation. The fact that it produced some very interesting and important results is perhaps a separate issue. There is a dividing line, I think, between I could have done I could have done, I think, the skin testing perhaps without ethical approval, but I had a very low threshold for applying for ethical approval, and I thought, well, this is something that is new. It's a little bit uncomfortable and invasive. It's not hazardous, but that I should obtain ethical approval for it. I could have applied for ethical approval for doing the lymphocyte subsets, but that seemed to me so much part of my responsibility to try and provide the best care, to be curious about my patient's immune system. It seemed very pertinent in the early 1980s. And if I could do that simply, and that my results might be helpful for the patients, then that was the right thing to do.
You know, Professor, that patients have told this inquiry that they were not aware of their participation in something called the AIDS study. The inquiry obviously has evidence from a written statement from Dr. Carr about his involvement. Were you yourself directly involved in discussions with patients about the samples for the AIDS study and what they were required for? Or was that left to Dr. Carr?
Dr. Carr certainly saw most of the patients because it was his responsibility to see people who, when they first came up with acute bleeds. I'm sure I will have seen some of the patients, possibly not only when they came up acutely with bleeds or other reasons, but at my review clinic, and I would have explained what we were doing.
When you say you would have explained what you were doing, what can you remember actually explaining as a matter of fact about this work to patients?
I was asked about this in the Penrose inquiry in some detail. I'm afraid my memory has faded rather, and I would ask you to view the Penrose inquiry as the best I could do in 10 years ago.
Can I ask you, I note the time, sir, but on the same topic, just a question arising out of one paragraph in your witness statement that I think is related to this. It's WITN 3428001, please, Shumik, page 81. You'll see the question that you were asked at the top of the page: did you continue to use blood products to treat patients after becoming aware of the possible risks of infection of HIV? Why? And then in paragraph 211, you say, I continued to use blood products after it became apparent that AIDS in 1982 might be caused by a transmissible virus for the following reasons. You've set out a number, many of which we've covered. If we go over the page, if we look at little j, please. It says, part of continuing to use blood products was to establish from early 1983 onwards an active programme to monitor the immune status of those with haemophilia. One reading, at least, of that, Professor, is that one of the reasons for continuing to use blood products after you became aware of the risk of AIDS was to see if your patients developed the signs of AIDS. Is that what you meant?
No. What I meant by this sentence in J is that it had become clear in 1982 that the immune status of some patients could decline very markedly and give rise to the clinical condition of AIDS in the United States. There was much uncertainty about the cause, and that uncertainty persisted until I would suggest, and I have evidence, at least until February 1984. And it was therefore, I think, very important to monitor the immune status of patients, because one of the possibilities is that the immune decline was in some way related to the treatment they were receiving separate from putative AIDS virus. And it's clear from the studies that we did that, and others, that the clotting factor concentrates did in fact cause immune suppression, sufficient, I would suggest, to have predisposed the children in Birmingham to tuberculosis. To a patient, I reported, or Professor Dr. Watson, now Professor Watson, when he was working with me, reported a patient who had the features of AIDS and in Candida esophagitis in 1992, but was HIV negative, but clearly was immunosuppressed by the concentrate. I don't know whether you're going to come on to discuss it, but when patients were exposed, unfortunately, to this implicated batch that was infected in Edinburgh in the spring of 1984, it was those with the most abnormal T-cell ratios that were at greater risk of infection. So these, I think, are clinical evidence that use of clotting factor concentrates led to immune suppression. And having reviewed some of the literature recently, I think it's probably because of the immunoglobulin of the clotting factor, the factor VIII concentrates that was responsible. And it may be that is why patients with Haemophilia B, who are treated with a different product, who had normal T-cell numbers, they tended not to get infected. They were at far lower risk of HIV infection. And that has only occurred to me in the last couple of months, that maybe many more people got HIV with Haemophilia A because they were predisposed as a result of the immunoglobulin call it a contaminant, it wasn't meant to be there, whereas there was very little immunoglobulin in factor IX concentrates. That's a bit speculative, but it occurred to me that could be a possible explanation as why people with Haemophilia B, not so many became infected. There are other possible explanations. If you want me to go into them, I'm happy to do so, but I suspect you don't.
It is one of the reasons why you were resolved to continue using factor concentrates, your desire or ambition to have this active program of monitoring immune status, which you could only undertake if patients were receiving factor concentrates.
We assess the immunity of people on cryoprecipitate as well, and probably no treatment as well. So is that your question?
Well,
was it only people who got concentrated who got immune tests?
It wasn't quite my question. I'm trying to understand what you were saying. It may be a partial answer, but I'm trying to understand what you're saying in paragraph 211J, which appears to suggest that a reason for continuing to use factor concentrates was your wish to have to be able to monitor immune status. In other words, Professor, did your, whether you call it research or investigative ambitions, drive the treatment policy?
No. Treatment decisions were driven by what seemed to be best for the patient. But if what seemed to be best for the patient was the use of clotting factor concentrates or other therapy, then that should be monitored, as we were doing for all the other monitoring investigations. I'm sorry, no, it was not the other way around.
So I note the time. I've not yet finished my questions. I don't have a huge number of further questions myself, but I do have some, and I have some that have been suggested by call participants.
Well, let me turn to that in a moment, but I'm just fascinated by this recent exchange, because if I've understood it correctly, please tell me if I'm wrong, but what you are describing is that in 1983, early 1983, you realized that factor concentrates not only gave rise to a potential risk of non-A, non-B infection and a real risk of HIV infection, but there was a third problem, which was neither hepatitis or HIV, but that was the problem that they might, in any event, separately, give rise to a deterioration in the immune system, which in general would not be a good thing. Have I understood that correctly?
Absolutely correctly, yes.
So there were now three reasons why factor concentrates were potentially undesirable if there were any proper alternative.
Yes.
So far as monitoring was concerned, what was the purpose? Had the monitoring shown a decline in the immune system? What treatment? How would treatment differ in consequence?
Well, what we did was to repeat the immune tests we were doing, the subset tests. And one of the things we observed was that they didn't decline. They stayed steady, which was, if you like, reassuring. What wasn't reassuring, and I've not described the results of the skin tests, but in a word, the skin tests show the more factor concentrate you received, the lower score you got on your skin test. So there was a direct dose relationship between the skin test results, and that was more concerning. We followed that up over the years, and in people who were HIV negative, that stayed constant. It didn't decline further. Unfortunately, the people who developed HIV infection, their skin tests declined further.
Now, as you said in your exchange with counsel, the purpose of monitoring has to be determined at the outset. You know what you're monitoring for, and you have an idea why you're monitoring. You would not necessarily have known when you started monitoring that the immune function as displayed by the T cell count, CD4 count, would be the same from reading to reading, at least in those who were HIV negative. So what were you anticipating would or might happen if the readings in such a person varied to the disadvantage of the individual, showed that there was a decline in their immune system? What was going to happen?
Well, the first thing is, it was a little bit reassuring that the lymphocyte abnormalities were not related to the dose of treatment. So the degree of abnormality was not related to the amount of therapy. That was reassuring.
It didn't exclude, I suppose, a threshold effect, but beyond that, certainly, that would be the
there may well have been a threshold effect. I mean, I'm happy to go to the 1984 paper if that would help.
No, I don't want to trouble you with that. I've taken you out of your answer. I'm sorry, but it was my interruption. I beg your pardon.
The reason I was suggesting going to it, there's a figure in the paper that shows two peaks, a graph with two peaks of helper suppressor ratios. One peak is equivalent to the normal, and there's a completely separate peak for some of the patients. Patients about half and half. Half have abnormal levels as a peak, if I can put it that way, and half the patients had a peak that corresponded to normal people. And so it looked rather as if there was a switch. Now, I'm not an immunologist, but it looked as if some patients were particularly susceptible to having abnormal ratios, and it wasn't related to the dose of concentrate that they received. So we showed later on that the tissue type, the HLA type of individuals was related particularly to the rate at which they declined clinically, sadly, after they got HIV infection. I'm sorry, I can't quite remember how the HLA data might have related to the lymphocyte subset data in 1982. I can't remember whether we looked at that. I think we did look at it. But it would be an indication, possibly, of a genetic predisposition to switch.
Thank you very much. Now, what Council has just told me is that she has some more questions for you, and I think what she's indicating is that they aren't questions which might be finished within the next 20 minutes or so, in which case we might ask you to go on. So I think you're entitled to a choice, because you had anticipated finishing at about lunchtime today. Let me give you a choice whether we finish by continuing this afternoon. You will finish this afternoon.
Oh, yes.
And do you have any sense of timing? It may be difficult because you don't know what questions core participants might have to ask, or for that matter, what Mr. Reid might want to ask, if he wants to ask any questions to clarify the evidence.
I certainly have no idea as to that. I've got some idea of core participant questions because I've had a number overnight, but obviously the opportunity needs to be given to core participants to suggest some more. I would think I've got about an hour, including the questions I've had so far from core participants that I'm proposing to ask. There may be some more that arise out of this morning's evidence, I don't know. But it's roughly of that magnitude, but you know how poor council are at time estimates.
Generally speaking, Professor, if I'm given an estimate by council, I double it. But
I don't think so.
It's a useful rule of thumb, but it's the offer really is to give you a choice whether we go on this afternoon. We'll finish sometime this afternoon, probably earlier rather than later, I think, is the sense of what's just been said to me, or whether you prefer to come back on another day. The other day most probably would be the 14th of December, Monday week.
Thank you for the invitation. I think it would be most helpful to the inquiry if I continued this afternoon. I'm happy to have a break for lunch and continue this afternoon.
Well, I thought that's what you might say, but I want, particularly in the light of recent conversation about other things, to give you the chance of consenting, knowing what the position is.
Thank you for explaining what the offers are, and I accept to come back after some lunch.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Much appreciated. We'll take a break now, then, until quarter past 2. Quarter past 2 long enough? Quarter past 2.
Yes, fine.
Thank you.